I think I joined the Bruges Group as a teenager. And as Barry said, I set up a Eurosceptic group on campus in 1990. And the then head of the Bruges Group, Patrick Robertson, who never had a shrinking violet issue, said, no, you must call it the Bruges Group. And I said, well, I'm not sure that anyone will really know what that means. So we went with Campaign for an Independent Britain. And that was, my word, we were a tiny minority in those days. I think I really got stuck in. I see our friend Bill Cash over there. Let's give him a round of applause for what he's done over the years. But I spent a long chunk of my holidays in my first year as an undergraduate in his flat in Staffordshire, drafting 2,000 amendments to the Maastricht Treaty. And I did that along with a man called Syed Kamal, who I now share an office with in the House of Lords. But we were, my word, we were few in those days. So, and do I see Henrik Overgaard Nielsen over there, who's another of the long marchers, now, I think, playing in a rock group with Syed. We're trapped in some kind of Anthony Powell novel. It's all the same thing. But I really wanted to say thank you to all of you in this room for making it happen. If we think how unpopular we were, how few we were, and how fierce were the forces ranged against us in the 1990s, to have come from there to deliver a majority in a popular referendum against all the party leaderships, all the corporations, all the financial institutions, all the trade unions, all the quangos, and every foreign government, as we just heard, was little short of miraculous. So to all of you in this room, and I can recognize one or two other faces among the long marchers, to all of you who were part of that, thank you and congratulations. And John is right, he was actually not just the only foreigner in Vote Leave on the night that the result came in, but the only person who hadn't been involved in the campaign, because as you said, we bumped into each other in the stairs. It happened that our headquarters in Vote Leave was in the same building as the Fox News studio, and it could not have been more apt that such a defender of sovereignty and such a friend to our country should have been present at the moment that we reclaimed our independence. John, I've always thought, is a sort of eternal type of the American patriot. I note that every bartender in every Western has modelled his facial hair on John Bolton's. And they, like him, are, if you like, the conquerors of the frontier, the hard-working and underappreciated people, underappreciated by the stars of the movies and underappreciated by the audience. But they are the people who turned those wild and empty countries into part of the world's greatest republic. And they did so with courage, optimism, and patriotism, which at its best are the virtues upheld by the United States, a country that, when push comes to shove, carries the loftiest dreams of mankind. John has always been a great public servant and a great patriot, and it is his misfortune and his government's shame that that patriotism is not reciprocated, and that he should now find himself on the receiving end of an almost Latin American political persecution simply because he refuses to join the personality cult of a leader. I want to go back to where Barry started when he introduced the evening, talking about the Anglo-American alliance, what it stood for, and where it's going. And I want to take you right back to the start of it, a few months earlier than that Churchillian address to Congress. I want to take you back to a day in August 1941, a long summer day off Newfoundland, the day that Franklin D. Roosevelt made the longest walk of his presidency. In a way that would nowadays be unimaginable, the media of that time conspired to hide the fact of FDR's disability, his polio, from the population. So every photograph of Franklin Roosevelt showed him seated or standing unaided. But that day, in order to go and see Winston Churchill on the deck of HMS Prince of Wales, the president was determined to walk. His advisors told him not to. They said, what if the deck bucks? You'll be left in an ungainly heap on the floor. But he insisted. And so, supported by his son on one side and by a naval officer on the other, he made his slow way across the deck while the band of HMS Prince of Wales struck up the Stars and Stripes Forever. And what followed was the greatest imaginable demonstration of what bound and binds our countries together. It happened to be a Sunday morning, and so the crews of the two warships, the USS Augusta and HMS Prince of Wales, were mustered together for a joint religious service. Churchill had chosen every detail, personally and meticulously, down to the hymns, down to the reading that the chaplain gave from the pulpit. Came from Joshua 2. As I was with Moses, so will I be with thee. I will not fail thee nor forsake thee. Be strong and of good courage. And afterwards, ecstatically, Churchill burst out the same language, the same hymns, the same ideals. When he said the same ideals, he wasn't making a bland generalization about being the goodies. Think of the world as it stood in August 1941. The entirety of the Eurasian landmass, from Brest and Lisbon to Vladivostok, was under one form or another of authoritarian government. Liberty was thrown back to the Anglosphere and a small portion of the Western Hemisphere. The values that he was talking about when he said the same ideals, now, after these long years of Western and Anglosphere hegemony, can seem universal. Free speech and uncensored newspapers, regular elections, equality before the courts, habeas corpus, jury trials. But they were developed overwhelmingly in the language in which you're listening to my words. We talk about them as universal values, but you know what? We're really being polite. They became universal because of the willingness of the English-speaking democracies to deploy proportionate force in defense of freedom. Imagine that the Second World War had ended differently. Imagine that the Cold War had ended differently. There had been nothing universal about them then. Permanence is the illusion of every age. We can easily fall into the trap of being blasé about the sublime inheritance we have, which elevates the rules above the rulers, elevates process above outcome, and thereby guarantees the dignity and equality of all adult citizens. It's far more contingent and precarious than we like to admit. It dates in its present form from that meeting in Placentia Bay, which gave rise to the Atlantic Charter, which then effectively became the Allied war aims, which then effectively became the NATO aims, and after 1990 became the dominant form of government on the planet. It's one human lifetime. And unless we work at it, it can very easily be lost. Now, this is a Bruges Group meeting. I'm guessing most of you voted leave. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands as to why you all did. I'll tell you why I did. If I summarize it into three baskets, it was democracy, deregulation, and Atlanticism. Democracy, being governed under our own laws, having the right to hire and fire the people who pass those laws, no longer having a foreign, unaccountable court as the supreme power on our own soil. Deregulation, being able to set our rules to our own conditions and needs, instead of having inappropriate and burdensome rules imposed on us from the outside. And Atlanticism, a restoration of our relations with the other great English-speaking democracies and the Commonwealth, countries to which we're connected by language and law, by habit and history, by commerce and kinship. I have to say, looking back, I have not, things have not worked out as well as I'd hoped when I cast my ballot on that long June day in 2016. I had underestimated the immobilism and determination of our standing bureaucracy, the readiness of the unelected part of our government machine to frustrate policies with which they disagreed. Let me take one example from each of the three baskets I gave you. Democracy obviously should mean the ability to decide who can come to this country and, crucially, who's allowed to stay in this country. But we took power back from Brussels and then left it in the hands of unaccountable judges and officials. I think a lot of people really struggle to believe, unless they've been up close to it, unless they've seen it at first hand, how powerless an elected minister is within our system of government. Ministers make all sorts of promises of all parties, right? We're going to speed up these applications, we're going to kick out the people who shouldn't be here. And then they arrive and find themselves encased in an inert state machine, stabbing at buttons that are no longer connected, tugging at levers that have worked loose. I don't imagine for a moment that even this government wants to have these flotillas of illegal migrants washing up on the south coast every day. Even if we assume that they are unprincipled shysters, you have to at least give them credit for wanting to be re-elected. Of course, they don't want this situation. But they find that with the entire system rigged in favor of allowing people to stay here, it's extraordinarily difficult to do anything about it. You can infer, I think, as much from the fact that the Rwanda scheme of the last government was taken to court by the trade union that represents immigration officials, right? People who were supposed to be in charge of enforcing the policy went to court to stop the removal of illegals, as you can by the eventual overturning of that policy by our courts. And so there was no point. I remember endlessly, including at one big Bruges Group meeting in West London, I remember saying, I do not want to take power back from Brussels and then just leave it festering in Whitehall. I want to take power and then push it downwards and outwards to local government or to individual citizens. That has not happened. I give immigration as one example, but you can all think of hundreds more. And it's, in fact, the second of my baskets, the idea of deregulation, of freer trade with the world, of getting rid of the more OTOs and pettifogging of Brussels rules, that again was frustrated not for lack of ministerial will, but by the power of the standing apparat. Again, let me give you one example. It's a trivial example, but I think a telling example precisely because trivial. It won't make any front pages, but it exactly encapsulates why things have been so slow to change. And this is the example of tomatoes. In 2023, those of you who can cast your minds back to the headlines of that year, we had a tomato shortage. You remember that? It was all in the papers. The supermarket shelves were bereft of those crimson umami-flavored globes, and the price had apparently shot up and so on. What was never reported, what was almost never mentioned, is that during that supposed tomato shortage, we still had tariffs on all tomatoes from outside the EU. Why? Who do we think we're protecting? Right? Our single biggest source of tomatoes, cucumbers, a bunch of other fruits is Morocco. There's another Hashemite, the Kingdom of Morocco, right? Old friend of ours, ally since Elizabethan times. When we were in the EU, we had to apply EU tariffs and trade policies because we were part of the customs union. And so, in order to protect tomato growers in Spain, and to a lesser extent, Portugal, France, and Italy, we adopted these high tariffs against tomatoes from outside. Now, I ask again, who are we protecting? Look, I know we do occasionally grow some tomatoes at the height of summer here. The Isle of Wight used to be part of my Euro region. I am aware, but even at the height of our growing season, which is a very short one, we are still a big net importer of tomatoes. We do not come close to supplying our domestic market. And by the way, even if that's your argument, it's a very poor one because the Moroccan tomato growing season and the British tomato growing season do not overlap by a single day. They are counter-seasonal, right? So again, who are we protecting? Why are we still applying policies designed to favour vested interest groups on the continent that, even from the most protectionist point of view, even if I were a full-scale, full-fat Trumpy, cannot be justified because we don't produce the stuff ourselves. I get tomatoes. It's equally true. We still have tariffs on olive oil, right? To my knowledge, we don't grow any olives here. I occasionally read in the Daily Telegraph that someone in Cornwall has managed to grow tea or something. So it's possible that there might be some olive plantation out there, what with the warming climate. But let me stay on very safe ground and say that we are not a major global producer of olives, and yet we are paying tariffs on the olives and olive oil from Turkey, from Tunisia, and all the rest of it. Why? What possible rationale? Well, you can imagine I was on the Board of Trade after Brexit, and I kept pushing, not only for this, for liberalisation across the board, but this is the one I want to focus on because it so neatly illustrates the point. Every minister said, yes, of course, this is absolutely absurd, let's get rid of it. And it just didn't happen. They kept on giving instructions, and it didn't happen, and it didn't happen. Oh, well, minister, it's all part of this big package, and we mustn't give it away, but it'll happen very soon. On several occasions, I actually went through this little choreography with the minister in the House of Lords, terribly sweet man, Richard Bennet, where we would pre-arrange a Q&A so that he could get it on the record. I would stand up and say, can my noble friend tell me when we're going to get rid of these tariffs on Moroccan tomatoes? And he would say at the dispatch box, yes, I've given instructions for this to happen. Any day now. And he would say that so that it would be on the record in Parliament, so his officials couldn't pretend that he hadn't said it. Still hasn't happened. Right? So I could give you more dramatic ones, but think of how many thousands of those Moroccan tomato examples there are. Why have they not done it? Well, look, I've run out of alternative explanations because a big chunk of our permanent nomenclatura want to go back into the customs union and therefore don't want to diverge one iota from EU trade and tariff policy because it will complicate our going back in. But it's the third basket that I really wanted to talk about, it being our theme tonight, my dream of Atlanticism. And I feel I may lose a bit of the audience here, but I worry that the principles of the Atlantic Charter of 1941 are being lost rapidly in the United States, more slowly and more insidiously here, because we are failing to sustain them, and I think we don't appreciate our good fortune in having inherited what we did. Shouldn't it bother us that it's now normal to go to court to contest every election? Wasn't part of the deal of what made Anglosphere democracy a readiness to accept outcomes that we didn't like if they were legitimate outcomes, right? When our party lost, we accepted the umpire's decision. When we thought a law was a stupid law, we nonetheless obeyed it and we tried to change it through the proper democratic mechanisms and procedures. That is not happening. Even if the President of the United States were otherwise a man of unimpeachable modesty, wisdom, intelligence, self-restraint, and good looks, it would still, for me, be a deal breaker that on 3 subsequent occasions, at every election he fought, he had declared before a single ballot had been cast that he could not lose other than through fraud. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it seems to me that when you're in a democracy, there should be a penalty for being anti-democracy. And that's what it is when you say that the only outcome you will accept is one where you win, that otherwise it's illegitimate. That is an attack on the fundamental system, that the fundamental belief that process matters rather than just outcome. I don't want to harp on the travails and persecutions of many good public servants, of whom John Bolton is just the latest in line. But, you know, I spent the early part of my life in South America, and I always used to think that with time, as those countries became wealthier and more educated, more literate, that they would become more like North America. It seemed to me I made the classic error of assuming permanence and progress, of being a teleological observer, of thinking that there would be progress towards some wealthier, happier, and freer liberal paradigm. But actually what we see is the opposite. What we see is the US becoming much more like Latin America, with the personality cults, with the readiness to use and weaponize the justice system to go after people that you don't like, with the picking of fights with neighbors, threats of annexation against Canada and Denmark, a classic sort of caudillo move, and with the absolute unwillingness to recognize that there should be a distinction between the public office of the head of state and his private interests. Again, you get the odd rogue. It happens in politics, but it's the way in which the country is going along with this. Was I alone in finding it slightly grotesque that he kind of quadrupled or something his personal wealth with that digital currency scam within days of taking office? Wasn't there a time when people would have objected to that? Or at least tut-tutted about it? But the danger is that in an utterly polarized society, when everything is seen through the prism of hurting the other side, we lose our sense of what elevated and ennobled our societies in the first place. And it's here that I really do want to dwell on foreign policy for a second. What was the really distinctive development of the Atlantic Charter? What was the thing in terms of international relations that most defined the world after 1941 when it was signed, but particularly after 1945, or at least after 1944 when we could enforce it? The idea that you couldn't just invade a neighboring country. That is what distinguishes the post-war from the pre-war era. The idea that national sovereignty, territorial jurisdiction, and the integrity of existing borders had a force and a permanence beyond the capacity of small countries to defend themselves. That it was everybody's business when that international order was undermined, because we'd all seen where that led before. And what's extraordinary about the Russian invasion of Ukraine is there isn't even a pretense of some disputed border here. There isn't even it's not one of those long-standing disputes where different maps show different things. It was a straightforward invasion because they could. Straightforward Machtpolitik. And that's exactly what the NATO alliance and the Western order was set up to stop. And it's made the world, by the way, a lot freer and a lot happier, right? Steven Pinker argues in his book on the decline of crime that the single best thing to happen to the human race was having some kind of functioning police force, some kind of social order that meant that not all of us had to defend all of our own property personally, that we could outsource that and then use all the time that was freed up by not having to patrol around with shotguns to make and sell and invent other stuff. Well, something similar, I think, pertains among nations. Right? Obviously, I'm no more a globalist or supranationalist than John is. I'm a Brugist. But there are some old precepts that predate the modern order. And one of them, for example, is the sanctity of diplomatic missions. It's quite striking that a week ago, the Russians struck the British Council and the EU mission in Kiev. I mean, if the United States invaded Cuba tomorrow, one assumes that the diplomats would be peaceably evacuated through neutral countries. Barely a peep. It made absolutely no difference either here or in the US to the rhetoric. And I find this deeply alarming, that we've become so polarized, so partisan, so one-sided, that we are now effectively siding with the aggressor, which invaded a country that offered it no threat, because everything is seen through the prism of, Russiagate, Hunter Biden, whose side are you on, etc. We should hold ourselves to a higher standard. Okay, what's my solution? What are my solutions? Well, first of all, more democracy. We should be doing what I'd hoped we would have done after the referendum, pushing powers downwards and outwards, having more referendums, having more direct democratic control of decision-making. Decisions should be made as closely as possible to the people that they affect, and by officials that we can hire and fire, right? Now that is going to mean some massive changes, particularly in our judicial system. Yes, obviously we should leave the European Convention, or at least derogate from those parts of it that prevent us from controlling our borders. But don't make the mistake of thinking that that is a silver bullet. If we left the ECHR tomorrow and made no other changes, I don't think there would be any impact on the ground in terms of the illegal migration, or indeed in terms of the inability to deport criminals or other undesirables. First of all, there's a bunch of other treaties that are regularly now cited by our courts, ranging from the UN Convention on Refugees to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We need to look very carefully at the way in which they are being used to overturn the will of Parliament. Then we have a load of domestic statutes, and indeed domestic case law. And even if we got rid of all of that, we are left with a highly politicized judiciary, several of whose members are now openly in the business of making rulings on the basis of what they think the law ought to say, rather than what it says. I cite it only because it's the most recent example, but the judge in the case on the asylum hotel in Epping, the appeals court judge who overturned the earlier ruling that it could be closed down, was a member of the chairman of the Fabian Society, chairman of the Society of Labour Lawyers, a founding member of Matrix Chambers, right? These are, this is, and nobody thought that odd, right? Nobody thought, well, he's an outlying left-wing judge. That is where the judiciary is coming from, which is why we have all of these extraordinary cases of repatriation orders being overturned because somebody's partner finds it too hot in the Caribbean, or somebody's wife doesn't like the food in Albania, or whatever it is. Because we have a group of people who are legislating from the bench, determined always and everywhere to overturn deportation orders, however flimsy the pretext. We need to tackle that. We need more democracy, we need more sovereignty. We need to pull out of a number of these treaties. I'd like to have more direct democracy. I'd like to have more referendums. The great Indian economist Amartya Sen said, don't ask whether a nation is fit for democracy, it becomes fit through democracy. One of the countries in Europe that has avoided an awful lot of the travails of its neighbours is Switzerland, because the Swiss citizens, being regularly badgered for an opinion and a vote, are extraordinarily informed about how much their government spends, about what the trade-offs are. They have become better voters through a more democratic system. What else? Two other solutions. First, in terms of foreign policy. I haven't given up on the Anglosphere, but I do feel we can go ahead with a coalition of the willing. The essence of close and institutionalized cooperation in foreign policy is that you do it with countries that you know you're never going to fall out with. Now, which countries are in that category for us? Which serious, I mean, I'm not talking about tiny ones, but which serious countries capable of deploying force are in the category that it is unimaginable that we'd ever be on opposite sides in a war? Well, I can't really say the United States with confidence, not under this administration. But I would still say Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. I think there's a very strong case for going ahead with a Kanzuk arrangement that would provide for free movement, at least of labour, without benefits rights, much closer free trade, and institutionalized diplomatic and military cooperation. And I'd love to leave the door open for a future US administration. But at the moment, I don't see any prospect of the current one being interested. We should go ahead. By the way, that would sort of double our GDP. It's a very, very immediate question that, I mean, John will be more expert than I am on this, but a very immediate question caused by the Putinite policy of the White House, which is, what about our nuclear deterrent? We could have the same level of autonomy that the French have. We could make all our own stuff, which is, I mean, we do have operational autonomy. We can still press the button, but we don't have autonomy in spare parts, servicing, and all that, right? To do that would cost us about twice as much. We'd need, effectively, to build a rocket industry from scratch. Well, if we went in with our Kanzuk partners, we would roughly double our GDP. It would become affordable. We'd have the economies of scale that would allow us to develop advanced drones, satellite communication satellites, computers, and so on. But really, where I think all this comes, what it all comes down to is, do we still care about the order that our fathers were prepared to defend with force of arms? Do we still believe that it matters that we live in a country where the rules are above the rulers, where the people in charge don't get to make things up as they go along, and where we leave personality cults, however much we agree with one or two policies, to people in hot countries where the leaders wear sunglasses? There is, and I ask that question in a spirit of some trepidation, because I know there'll be people in this room who are thinking, how, appalling, why are you attacking Trump? Trump derangement syndrome, da, da, da. I can see it happening here. I could see the backlash against the authoritarianism of the other side being so powerful that it sweeps away the norms of civil society and forms an authoritarian reaction, which is every bit as illiberal, every bit as self-pitying, and every bit as ready to mobilize the full coercive power of the state to turn against people that you don't like. And that, I think, would be profoundly un-British, just as what is happening now in the US is profoundly un-American. I can't think of anything more un-American than a personality cult. So this requires education. This is where I think we've gone wrong. Our education system should be about elevating and inculcating certain ideas that don't come naturally, such as the idea that people that you don't like might occasionally have something useful to say. Spend a couple of minutes on social media if you think that idea comes naturally, right? Such as the idea that truth is not determined by the status of the person speaking, but is intrinsic. That truth can be worked out by logic and empiricism, by experimentation, that the scientific method is real. These things have to be taught. We don't tumble to them independently. And that used to be the role of universities and of secondary education. But at some point in the earlier part of this century, they stopped doing that, and indeed they started doing the opposite. They started teaching that our individual dignity and our reason was subordinated to other characteristics. They started teaching that the single most important thing about you is that you're white or female or whatever it is. And this has now led to a return of a measure of identity politics on both sides. And I remember at the time, at the height of the BLM madness, I remember thinking, this is not going to end well, because the response when it comes is not going to be a return to civil liberalism and a belief in the equality of everybody before the law. It is going to be an equally ethnic-focused and aggrieved but majoritarian response, which I think we're now seeing. Hasn't yet translated into politics in the way that it has in the US, but I can see it going in that direction. So I would close by saying, by repeating what John Milton, the great blind poet John Milton, said to the Lords and Commons in the 1640s, remember what nation it is whereof ye are. We are the country that developed, refined, and exported the sublime ideal of the rule of law, that it doesn't matter who you were, that the law bound the king as surely as the meanest subject in his kingdom. We were the country that stood for Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, the elevation of the individual above the collective. Not only have we stopped exporting that, we've stopped teaching it to our own children. We've stopped teaching them that they are not a random set of individuals born to a different random set of individuals, but that they are the inheritors of this sublime patrimony, and that inheritance carries with it an obligation to keep it intact and pass it on securely to the next generation. That is our task, especially those of us in this room who still believe in what Britain stands for. Remember what nation it is whereof ye are.